So I'm going to do a quick demonstration of a couple of variations of the Bulgarian split squat, and then I'll get back in front of the computer and have a longer discussion about this. And the original variation of the split squat was done by coaches that came over from Bulgarian weightlifting, and they were using it at a maybe 4 to 6 inch rear foot elevation. And what we traditionally see done nowadays in gyms across America is people using kind of that traditional bench height, which is more in like 16 to 18 inch range, so almost 3 times the height that the original version of the exercise was performed at. So I just want to show kind of how they look, and then we'll get into a discussion. This little shelf down here is somewhere in that range. And notice the range of motion I can move through on that. So now I'll do it over here. Okay, I'm gonna grab my chair and let's discuss. So if you've ever done Bulgarian split squats and you've put your back foot up on a bench and thought, man, this doesn't feel so great. And I hear this quite a bit from athletes and patients at the clinic. And you're not alone if you think this. And what if I told you that, kind of like I said in the beginning of the video, the original version of the split squat is not how you typically see it performed today in the gym. And the Bulgarian split squat came to North America and started becoming popular in sometime the late 1980s. One of the Bulgarian weightlifting coaches, Angel Spazhov, came over and was working with some of our coaches. And that original version he was showing our coaches was not done at this like 16 to 18 inch standard gym bench height. He was elevating the back foot just 4 to 6 inches off the ground. And somewhere along the way, the bench kind of became the default, and likely because gyms have benches and not every gym conveniently has these 4 to 6 inch height boxes. And then convenience slowly turns into dogma. So people assume that if the rear foot isn't on the bench, you're doing the exercise wrong, but that's not really that true. In fact, I think for most people, it's going to be the opposite. The less correct variation to pick would be that higher foot version. And let's go ahead and compare the two. So if that rear foot is elevated just 4 to 6 inches off the ground, that's going to allow most people to very comfortably squat that front leg through a full squat pattern range of motion, nice and deep. The pelvis they'll be able to do a better job of keeping the pelvis kind of in a more flat, neutral position. They're going to create more force into the ground. They're going to have an easier time maintaining the balance demands of the exercise. But perhaps most important part of this is we can progressively overload that smaller height split squat for months and years. Like we can drive adaptation with that exercise a lot longer. And if we look at the bench, okay, there's going to be a very few people where it's going to be perfectly fine. But even for those people, I would still argue that the shorter height is still a better version for them. But for most people, when we put that increased height demand on that rear hip, we're putting them into positions that they don't possess. And I don't think that then they need to have more hip extensions and get higher. That's also not the argument. So what ends up happening, they're not loading that front leg very well, so they start to compensate. They're going to start to tilt the pelvis forward. They're going to get into lower back extension. The front leg range of motion is not as good. Even if you do have good hip extension, you can't get just the mechanics of having that back foot so elevated. It's just hard to get yourself into that good squat depth with that one leg. And then balance starts to become a limiting factor in the exercise when you're trying to increase the loading. So now the exercise isn't harder because the leg is working harder. The exercise is just becoming more difficult because the position is harder to be in. And then that's not the same thing. And that gets into a broader topic I'll probably discuss later. That's a huge mistake in fitness, is that people confuse difficulty with effectiveness. Making an exercise harder doesn't make it a better exercise. Standing on one leg is harder than standing on two legs. Standing on a Bosu ball is even harder than standing on the floor, but that doesn't automatically make either one a better strength exercise. The question you should always be asking when you're in exercise selection is, what is the adaptation I'm trying to create right now? And if the goal is to build a stronger quads and glutes, stronger leg for that person, I want your quads and your glutes to be the limiting factor of the exercise, not how well you can balance, not how well you can extend your hip. I don't want your mobility necessarily to be what's limiting us from driving long-term adaptation. The best exercise variation is the one that's going to allow us to express the most force through the greatest usable ranges of motion while we're continuing to maintain good mechanics. And for most people, and I would argue for everyone, the best way to do this is bringing that rear foot down. And I've been doing this for over 20 years with people. Hey, let's bring the foot down. I think it's better if we bring the foot down. I'll get pushback, but I continue to drive that home because that's the way I learned the exercise and the way I always thought it was supposed to be taught. But anyway, am I going to also say no one should ever use a bench? Of course not. If that's how you want to do it, go ahead. And some people, they're few and far between, but some of your people do have the range of motion, the control to drive adaptation with that exercise. And, maybe there's some weird sports specific reason you want to put people in that position. I don't know. But for the average person going to the gym, for our average recreational athlete, for the people that are coming to my clinic, and I would even argue for the vast majority of all athletes, the lower platform is going to be a more effective exercise to push them through. And that's the point, because we want the long-term progress. Many times people think the easier version becomes the version that they can load the heaviest, perform the most consistently, make the greatest long-term progress, and that's the point of the quote easier exercise. Both of them are difficult, but having the foot lower just means that you can do it more consistently and drive greater adaptations. So don't choose an exercise out there just because it looks more difficult. Choose a variation that lets you train the adaptation that you're actually trying to train. The long run strength isn't built by chasing more and more difficult variations of an exercise. It's built by doing effective exercises with consistency.